It's a pleasure to be here as your moderator. I'm actually going to ask my colleagues here to introduce themselves, but before we do, I might just spend 2 minutes with a couple quick observations. First, on the title of what we're talking about today. If I pick up my book, it says Innovative Financial Instruments with Social Return. And one thing I think it might be worth all of us thinking about up here, and then hopefully we can have a bit of a discussion on this, is what does innovative mean? There's been a kind of existential question in the world of finance for a long time of whether there's really been anything new in finance in a long time. And finance generally doesn't come up with true innovations that often, and often when they are innovations, they end up having unintended consequences. Somewhat familiar with that dynamic. And so as the kind of worldview shifts into the social sector a little bit with the idea of innovative finance, I think it is an interesting issue for us all to talk about a little bit, which is what, first of all, is innovative about what we're doing? Why hasn't it migrated to the social sector before? And what would be the potential unintended consequences we'll all have to live with? And I think as I ask each of my colleagues to introduce themselves, I might say, if we have about three or 4 minutes each, and if you could just say a little bit about your background, something about what you're doing right now that you think is really innovative and unique, and why you think traditional kind of private sector solutions haven't historically worked in this area. Maybe that can frame our discussion to start. So with that, I think I'll start on my right with Leah.
Hi, my name is Leah Peterson-Thomas. I work for Malaria No More. I'm a director there of an innovative financial instrument called Net Guarantee. Net Guarantee, in essence, is intended to accelerate the delivery of bed nets to parts of Africa. Between now, in terms of this discussion, when it ends, unfortunately 120 children will have died from malaria. So bed nets is a key component to actually fight and eventually eliminate the disease in Africa. So in terms of what we do in the innovation is we're providing a payment guarantee to manufacturers such that they have a comfort level to actually start production alongside some of the grant procedures and processes that take place currently. Thereby, we can actually deliver nets to market at the time of which countries receive grants for purchases. Unfortunately, currently, there may be a wait time of 6 to 12 months to do so.
I'll come back to the innovative part. Clara, would you introduce yourself?
Absolutely. I'm Clara Miller. I'm president and CEO of the Nonprofit Finance Fund. We are, for want of a better way to put it, an investment bank for not-for-profit social enterprises, social entrepreneurs, both for-profit and nonprofit, although most of what we do is in the nonprofit sector. And we've done about 200 million of our own direct lending, about a little over $1 billion, we think, in leveraged work. And debt is not even faintly innovative. So all of those things that have to do with debt is not innovative. I think that the thing we're doing that's more innovative right now, although is trying to invent what we're calling philanthropic equity. And there's no real version of what the private sector and the for-profit sector have as equity in the not-for-profit sector because there's no ownership of nonprofit corporations to begin with. And there's accounting issues that make visibility into what we would call equity difficult, which I won't bore you with now, which is a long song and dance. And that's, it's something that is needed far more, actually, than debt or even guarantees. Because with rapid growth of nonprofits, almost always you're losing $1 on every widget. You don't make it up in the nonprofit sector either. The difference is we stay in the business. And the sector exists because of a commercial flaw, and we're always correcting for that. And that business has actually failed. The for-profit market has failed or should not do what we do. And that therefore that's why we exist, and that's why the nonprofit sector goes on. So you have to correct for that when you innovate in that tax status. I'll stop there.
Come back, Julie.
Hi, I'm Julie Sunderland. I'm heading up a new program at the Gates Foundation, working very closely with Alex, who's been a great person to collaborate on this, where we're actually setting up a new $400 million pool to invest and deploy investment instruments across our different program areas. For those of you that aren't familiar with the Gates Foundation, those program areas are global health, global development, which is primarily financial services for the poor and agricultural development, and U.S. programs, which is primarily focused on education. So we're really looking across those different program areas to try to understand how we can put investment instruments to work. I think our minor innovation is to think about how do we deploy our two different pools of capital. So if you look at foundations, foundations have their endowment, which they typically invest fairly conservatively to generate the 5% return on their assets that allows them to pay out those 5% return per year, which is an IRS requirement in grants. So endowments have primarily invested in grants. A number have led the way in terms of doing what are called program-related investments. Some of them have done mission-related investments out of their endowment. We're actually sort of pulling the two together. We see our endowment as having a cost of capital of 5%, and we see our grants as being negative return capital, and we feel like if we can put those two pools of capital together, we can do some pretty innovative things in terms of taking positions that leverage external capital, leverage private capital. I'd like to make that a little bit more specific by talking about probably our first deal, which is we're providing credit enhancements to charter schools to allow them to access the tax-exempt municipal bond market. So if you think about this particular transaction, charter schools are pretty important in the U.S. education sector, but the capital markets might not view them as, they might view them as too risky to provide capital to. So by using our balance sheet, we're actually providing an enhancement via a guarantee to those charter schools, which then allows them to go out to the municipal tax-exempt bond market and potentially access millions and millions of dollars in capital to build charter schools facilities. So that's a small innovation. I think when we talk about innovative finance, what we're really talking about is taking pretty basic tools. Municipal bonds, I think, have been around for a long time. Credit enhancement, credit guarantees have been around for a long time. What we're thinking about doing is how do we use our capital to apply these to a new sector to really solve a social good.
Thank you. John.
John Nelson with Wall Street Without Walls. We're like Doctors Without Borders, except it's investment bankers who volunteer their time to help nonprofits and municipalities access the capital markets to do their transactions. We do not execute the transactions, but we've stimulated over $1 billion of transactions, small by capital market standards, but pretty good by the standards of nonprofits. And I think that's the innovation right there, is the capital markets linkage to the public purpose space. And there's more and more of that happening. That's a sea change from when I was. How many of you know Mark Rutte's name? Nobody? One person? Okay. Well, Mark Rutte was very famous at Columbia in 1968, 69. He was in SDS and he got arrested, and that was a kind of a wild time. I was a contemporary of his, not in SDS, but boy, I'll tell you, in 1968, you would not have seen a whole bunch of nonprofits and a whole bunch of investment bankers or Bain Capital types and et cetera, all in the same room talking about doing something together. You guys represent an innovation in and of yourself because you are mixing this kind of public purpose with highfalutin finance and corporate world activities. We are very interested in how can you find investments at scale from the capital markets, from the insurance companies, from pension funds, from large endowments. How can you leverage assets and leverage capital more effectively? Groups like CLARS are pioneers in leveraging debt, but most nonprofits don't think about leveraging debt. They think about looking for the next round of concessionary capital or the next grant. So what we represent in many ways is nonprofits thinking more like for-profits in terms of use of capital, in terms of leveraging of their assets. We do a lot of work with the Milken Institute, and Michael Milken, you may know that name, was one of the creators of the democratizer of capital, as it's called, the whole idea of structured finance. How can you look at different flows of capital coming into a transaction with different rates of return and make it work for the public? So one of the first transactions we did, which was an innovation, was we got S&P to get a rating for the Community Reinvestment Fund's $50 million securitization of small business loans in low-income communities. And that S&P didn't know what to do with this nonprofit securitization, but we were able to show them, and from that point forward, there's been about $300 million of securitizations rated by S&P, Moody's, et cetera. So the innovation that we represent is bringing capital markets at scale into the community development field so that we can have more mission capital. And then the final thing I will mention among all of us is that without without nonprofit profit, there is no mission. And too many nonprofits don't think about how to make sure they have sufficient reserves, how they make sure they have sufficient profits to function in times like we're going through right now. The public policy arena is something I'll touch on later. I think that policy is a gigantic driver of activity in our field, and we need to be on the lookout for how financial regulatory reform of the financial markets will affect all of us, and particularly those of us in the nonprofit field. So I'll save my other remarks until more questions.
Great. So as I just listened to you all speak, two questions come to my mind. First, one theme that we're all talking about is taking existing kind of corporate finance techniques and making them available to the social sector. And that, at some level, I think is understandable, definable, still maybe newer than it should be, but it's something we can explore a little more. But the other that I wonder about it has to do with sustainability. And the question I have in my mind, which I'd love you all to weigh in on, is what is the role of non-private sector capital with respect to partnering with kind of market forces around any of the kind of innovations that you're describing? And I'll make it specific. Should foundations be below market capital that partners with traditional private sector actors to deal with some of the issues you're talking about or we all confront? And if so, how do you create a sustainability paradigm so you don't always need a for-profit player and then a nonprofit player or a foundation to work on behalf of a nonprofit player? It's a little bit of the fish analogy, because there's only a limited amount of, teach a man to fish, verse. There's only a limited amount of philanthropic capital, foundation capital in the United States. There's something like $600 billion in endowment assets if you add all the foundation's endowments together. So if you figure they pay out 5% a year, that's $30 billion a year or something like that. So if a small portion of that is being characterized in the light that we're talking about today, that's a very little sliver of dollars in a sense. So how do you all think about it from a sustainability and uptake perspective? Who wants to start?
I'm happy to mention, from that perspective, we're looking at it from the view of correcting a market failure. Currently, the commercial, especially commercial insurers, are not in this market. We're addressing risks. As has been mentioned on this panel, these are basic tools that haven't yet been extended to the social sector. So we're attempting to partner with commercial entities such that we can correct the fact that there is an asymmetry of information, really provide facts up front to start to price out risk. Currently, payment guarantees are just a traditional form to cover risk, but yet commercial insurers refuse to touch Africa. They think of it solely as a high political risk. So we're trying to use the data gathered through some of the grant processes to correct that asymmetry of information and eventually price out risks, such as shifting and exiting this product onto the marketplace and making it sustainable for commercial underwriters to actually underwrite. In essence, we're also combining that with a collateral fund, looking at ways in which to leverage credit-worthy institutions and NGOs' balance sheets to the effect of creating a collateral fund to back these series of guarantees. Once we have approximately maybe around 5 guarantees, we'll certainly have enough data to then begin pricing out the risk and risk sharing with the marketplace. So from the standpoint of sustainability, our effect is to correct a market failure, demonstrate that correction, and then exit the product onto the commercial markets.
Why is it a market failure?
Well, currently the market failure is determined by the fact that there are a lack of players in the space. There's certainly enough data available to price out the risk, but it's a reputational issue that Africa carries as a whole. It's continually viewed as it's just viewed as a political risk. There's little attempt to actually enter the market space, and especially insurance in particular. Second, in light of the most recent exotic risk market failures, you could say, we're also dealing with a secondary aspect of we're trying to push a concept whereby we have data to price out risk, to actually share that risk, but there's lack of attempt to actually enter Africa based on the most recent failures with exotic products.
I want to ask Clara to weigh in, but I just want to make one observation, which is I agree with you, but I think there's another side to this where folks would argue that actually it's rational market decisions and there's higher returns of capital in other kind of geographic areas and other kinds of instruments. So it may not be seen as a market failure. It might be a market failure in terms of what we would like to happen. The question is, from just a maximizing your returns perspective, is it really a failure? It's just a philosophical question to put on the table.
Yeah, I think that one of the, failure is a kind of a hard word. And I think what we're talking about is development finance, so that you're actually serving and making the market at the same time. And in developing countries, like this market that was described, there's a huge commercial opportunity on the other side as well. In the US, where we mostly operate, we do some US-based international work. It's a structural kind of problem in the economy that's sometimes intermittent, it's sometimes permanent. We hope it's not permanent, but we're not actually building a banking system, let's say like microenterprise is in developing countries. We are trying to create a ramp to the capital markets or to the mainstream for many organizations that we actually think can operate sustainably themselves later on. It's important to point out that revenue, the main source of revenue for not-for-profit organizations, and I should say nonprofit, is a tax status. It is not a business plan. I deeply agree with the point that we need profitability to either scale or operate sustainably. That's an absolute requirement. But risk in the social sector is different, because risk is not actually to the lenders, it's not to the foundations, it's not to any of the players we would ordinarily look to, it's to the kid who's never going to learn to read, or the person who's not going to get vaccinated. So you have to think about risk when you're placing money in the social sector in a somewhat different way, because your risk to the person you're serving is so dire. And that makes it, kind of a double whammy as far as personal responsibility is concerned for the bankers. I think absolutely that that foundations, in answer to Alex's question, foundations have a very specific and important role to play in creating a ramp to the banking system for not-for-profits and social enterprises, in using their assets as soft money and soft capital so that organizations can grow sustainably. Because, as I said before, most not-for-profits, because we're fixing a market failure, for example, providing goods and services to people who have no money. This is hard to manage around. Our customers have no money. That when you lose a buck on every widget, you don't make it up in our sector either. The difference is we stay in the business. And you have to always be carrying a double load of capital requirement when you grow for that reason. I'll stop there.
Thank you. John, do you want to weigh in?
Well, just on the risk side, to go back to that community reinvestment fund deal, the nonprofit world, the community development field, their assets are considered risky, but they often perform much better than the traditional markets. CRF had a portfolio default rate of less than 30 basis points. And yet, when they tried to get a rating from S&P, they said, we don't have enough data to support giving you a rating. And so we were able, Wall Street Without Walls, through the Freedom of Information Act, to go to the SBA and get information about the so-called 504 loan program. We got $15 billion, more than 20 years of history, and showed a 2%, a 200 basis point default rate in that portfolio versus the 30 basis point. But they said it was a similar profile. So because it was enough data to do a risk analysis, they therefore took the SBA data as a proxy. And we were able to, get that rating right away. It pre-sold. It's performed well. So it's the perception of risk in the field and the lack of data that's a big problem. If another sort of appointment to that or addenda to that is the Community Reinvestment Fund has been a huge push for capital from the banks, and I'd like to come back to that later. A similar program was something called the New Markets Tax Credit Program. It was passed on December 15th, 2000. And again, testing your historical memory, that would be in the final moments of Bill Clinton's administration. And he had been pushing for this thing to go through in the worst way. Finally gets passed. The Republicans had been holding it back. Finally gets passed, but Phil Gramm, a Republican of Texas, senator, attached an amendment to the bill saying that credit default swaps should not be considered financial insurance. So Bill gets the deal. I don't know what Bill actually says, but Bill maybe asks Larry Summers. I don't know what he does, but he says, "What's a credit default swap?" Well, they say it's not a problem. It's going to innovate capital. It may be great. Signs the bill. $62 trillion later, there is a market failure.
Proving my point about unintended consequences. So, Julie, question for you: How do you feel about the risk of displacing market forces when foundations and others that aren't private sector actors decide to act where there's supposedly a private sector failure?
How do I feel about the risk?
Is there a risk that you're going to displace traditional market forces, and what happens next time? Will they need foundation capital for a deal that's similar to the one you're looking at?
Well, I would break it into sort of two layers, Alex. I think there are two kind of sets of potential opportunities for us to invest. There's the ones where there's a really clear market failure. I think Leah's example, we've seen some other examples. For example, we're looking right now at global health venture capital. We do a lot of investment into technology firms. We do a lot of seed investment to support R&D into global health. There's an existing venture capital community that's really, really good at assessing technology and building up the companies that can take this technology to market. And they're not putting any capital to work in the global health space because they don't understand developing country markets. It's an area where they just don't have the knowledge. So if we can, in that case, it's pretty simple. There's a market failure. We've got some knowledge, and we've got some capital that can help them consider this space. And so if we could go in to co-invest on a deal-by-deal basis to get them to be more familiar with this sector, that's a win-win.
But what's the market failure? I don't understand.
Lack of information, lack of understanding of the opportunities that exist.
So is the assumption that if there's a co-investment with foundation capital and the returns are really good, the next time around
That's right.
there'll be better information and they won't need other partners?
That's the hypothesis. And I think the same hypothesis is true
That's
with
true. I mean, we very much view this net guarantee as a demonstration project to the overall private sector, as well as the development community, such that the two can merge successfully. It's not necessarily a matter of one doing the job of the other. It's more a matter of addressing the fact that there needs to be a coupled shift into the private sector, that the two must work hand in hand with very innovative and successful organizations like the Gates Foundation in addressing some of these issues of the private sector, that there's a lack of entry into the market. So I don't see them actually replacing one another. I see them more less being very honest in the discussion, saying they need to work together in order to address the social needs at hand.
There is another set of deals, though, that I'm less comfortable with, which are the ones where the market case hasn't necessarily been proven. So, for example, another area that we're looking at very closely is smallholder financing in Africa. One of our core priorities is to build up incomes for smallholders in Africa. And if you look at the market for lending to smallholders, and if you look at the constraints around lending to smallholders, it's a really, really difficult business. So you could say that the market rationally will never lend to smallholders. Now, we're doing some tests to try to see, are there ways that we can provide credit enhancement to banks? Are there highly subsidized models that will go out and organize cooperatives up to the point where they're credit worthy? But they're pretty heavy subsidies. So are we over-subsidizing the market? Are we creating something that's never going to work? Are we potentially crowding out the market because the only entities, the only entities that will use the types of products that we're putting forward are ones that would get lending otherwise? So there's a lot of questions in areas where the markets aren't working effectively, and we think that we're going in to try to demonstrate something that might work, but we're not highly sure. But the social impact is obviously so important that we feel like we need to go in there. Yeah.
I want to ask John and Clara a specific question that I think is relevant in a business school, especially one of this. Did I just say business school? No, in an academic. Yeah, we'll say business school. Any academic institution. For a second, I thought I was in US Hall, and then I realized, but do you think part of the market failures that exist is that we have a shortage of skilled financial individuals, sector, investment bankers, whatever you want to call it, focusing on the social sector? I imagine there's a bit of a
Well, we have a
question.
surplus of investment bankers, basically.
But how about focusing? Well, are they focusing in the right place?
I was struck by, I think it was the Yale class of 2008, that I heard had 200 students that went into Teach for America. That's a gigantic, I think that's the most that any entity has ever hired from one particular Yale class. It's unbelievable. That's a sign of shift. But I think it was just maybe 10 years before that everybody was going to go to Goldman or wherever they were going to go to. So it's like these kind of things do shift. But I'm going to defer to Clara on the bulk of that question.
For lack of an investment banker, we would have a perfect world, is the theory of change. I think it's weird. I mean, I think that that if you imagine a 2x2 matrix of the market for loans generally, because when you say, okay, what's social enterprise? Well, what's anti-social enterprise? Almost every enterprise has some sort of social side to it. So what we're talking about is parts of the market that aren't served by the mainstream economy for some reason or another, right? And so you imagine a 2x2 matrix, and on one side is big and on small, and on the top is, complicated and simple, right? Well, the big banks, because of profitability, want to be in the big and simple square. They want very large-sized, standardized transactions. And then there's sort of like small and simple. Well, that would be the credit card business. You can treat it almost like an insurance product. But we are in the small and complicated part of the market, and it's always unprofitable. And what we're trying to do is to make it, to get it so that whether it's the people who are managing nonprofits, whether it's bankers, whoever it is, are more comfortable with those transactions. We made, as John said, we've made a lot of progress over the past 10 or 20 years in that direction. In the most recent, financial collapse, banks have retreated from our market for a while. It's very commercially painful for us when banks come into our market, but it's a mission win, right? So there was a study by a guy named Robert Yetman out at Davis who found that there was about the same levels of debt in the not-for-profit sector in the U.S. as there was in the for-profit sector for entities of approximately the same size, which is very, very small for nonprofits. And so it's not access to debt that is the problem in the nonprofit world anymore. And recently banks have kind of retreated. They will come back when things get better. It's really access to capital drawn more broadly, and access to reliable net revenue. If we solve the access to reliable net revenue problem completely, we wouldn't need a bunch of spindly little nonprofit banks like NFF to service the sector. We'd actually have a strong social sector that would be sustainable.
The garbage receivables can be securitized, and bankers will invest in them. They'll invest in anything as long as it's rated, as long as there are cash flows, and maybe you can have a credit default swap wrap around it. One thing that is true of these two worlds is that the nonprofit world is made up, maybe historically, maybe this is more of Clara's and my generation, a different kind of personality from a deal maker, capital markets kind of person. I mean, Clara is a deal maker. She is a deal maker. She's sort of a cross-dresser. Yeah, you are, actually. But my experience, we have about 150 volunteers, and they are basically let's do the deal. What's the deal? And they have an attention span of about a gnat. And that's really about it. And the nonprofit people, you go to talk with them, hey, let's talk, let's hang out. It's a whole different world. And I think that that's one thing that we in the nonprofit world have to be aware of, is that it's a different culture. I was running a Ford Foundation program at one point called the Corporate Partnership Program, and it dealt with linking nonprofits with for-profit companies in market-driven cases. And they did role-playing between the nonprofits and the for-profits, and there was a tremendous amount of distrust between those two circles. And this was over 10 years ago. So the fact that we're kind of merging that together is great, but I think there's still huge, huge culture differences, and that it's particularly in finance. And that's why I have to applaud Clara, because Clara is trying to build the nonprofit world to scale so that the investment bankers, these centered kind of thinkers, can in fact get involved and make some money and do some good. But policy is also going to drive a lot of that, and I think we ought to keep our mind on the policy implications. Maybe come back to that later.
I want to go to Leah, but I do want to observe that I have I guess a gnat-like mentality, because I was a banker for a long time before moving to a foundation.
No, I just want to comment. I appreciated Clara's earlier statements around sort of the mindset within banking and financial services. We bring this product, this payment guarantee, to an insurer, and they desperately try to fit it into their current division lines.
Right.
Is it trade credit? Is it
Right.
and coupling on top of the fact that in terms of access to credit, are we looking, or access to capital, are we also having a lack of access to innovation? There just seems to be a lack of access to innovation within the overall private, commercial, and financial sector. And something in terms of payment guarantee, specifically, we are opening the opportunity for a multi-million-dollar revenue stream over a series of potential decades to fight global disease to these multinational insurers, but yet there seems to be lack of recognition because there's just a shutdown because the product doesn't necessarily fit within one of their division lines. So I just really put that challenge on the table that there needs to be more access to innovation within the financial service sector to enable us to really do our jobs.
I want to open it up to anyone's observations, questions. I do want to put one on the table that people can choose to answer at any point or not, but we talk about innovations. If you could have a genie in a bottle and the genie comes out and said, all right, I'll give you one innovation. I'll make it happen. You tell me what it is. What's the innovation in the capital markets or in the funding markets or in insurance, or what do you specifically want? I put that on the table. Anyone who wants can weigh in on now, or we can just go to questions. If someone has an answer. You got an answer?
Well, we're very big on the leveraging of underutilized assets. The federal government has, for example, $10 billion of seized assets that come into its coffers every year, and they're sold off at auction at 40, 50, 60 cents on the dollar. Many, many cities own tracts and tracts of land of vacant, abandoned buildings and vacant lots that's blight. We have neighborhoods that have foreclosed homes that are falling into blight and causing, these are assets that need to be leveraged more effectively. So somehow we need to create these dead asset pools, starting at the federal level, and use them as credit enhancements to get the NAT-oriented investment bankers into the game, and as well as the insurance companies, the pension funds, and the foundations.
So what's the practical ask of the genie?
We need to have better credit enhancement vehicles. We need to have better leveraging of assets. We need to have pooling of assets.
Is that legislation then?
It can be done without legislation, but at the federal level you need legislation. We went to Treasury and they said they had to have some act of Congress, so we've been working on that as well. But you could do this on a regional basis, like in Seattle, for example. I've suggested it to Ron Sims.
All right. Julie, you look like you're going to say something.
Yeah, if I had a genie, I would ask them to come up with a credible mechanism for measuring social return that the market could get its head around. And the reason for that gets back to my current divide between the clear market failures. Like the clear market failures where we know that the commercial capital is going to come in, those are the easy wins. My concern is that there's a class of social enterprises out there that are doing great work, that are generating good revenues, but their returns are just not good enough to attract commercial capital. And there's been a huge amount of discussion about this social impact investor class. And if there was a way that we could create an alternative pool of capital that was interested in return, but interested also in the social impact. I think the big constraint to that, and there are a number of people that are thinking about this, is that social return factor and that credible analysis of social return. So I would ask the genie for that.
I mean, I don't, again, I'm not sure if this is, and Clara, please go. Okay, I'm not sure if this is necessarily an innovation, but I would like to see really the capital markets step up and provide a better investment, alternative investment vehicle for organizations like the Global Fund and others who are sitting on billions of dollars, which are probably, I think I read the Global Fund's financials one time, and they actually did invest in credit default swaps. So really, we have to ask ourselves, are these institutions handling these billions of dollars in the right way? And could they potentially be outsourced to other commercial entities that could earn an interest rate higher than LIBOR or higher just than the market? So it's not necessarily an innovation, but it seems to be just a lack of focus.
I'm going to vote for Julie's innovation with a little word of caution, which is that I don't think we really want to scale a lot. You know, we don't necessarily want to scale bed nets, right? We want to get rid of malaria.
Exactly.
So if we have and in the States there's a you know, when bad business models happen to good causes problem, which is prisons or foster care residences where you know it's a butts in seats or persons in beds business model. We don't want to scale foster care. We want to keep families together so we don't have foster kids. We don't want to scale prisons as we have, where that's one of our big industries now. We want to get rid of the need for prisons by having social equity. So I think we have to be extremely careful about wanting to scale some of these social solutions. What we really want to do, and this is the looking glass world that we're in the social sector, we're not looking to do that. We're actually looking, it's an ambivalent business proposition where we want to eliminate the need for ourselves from the market at the same time as we're becoming more sustainable and stronger in doing social missions. It's a very tough kind of management, and I just want to put that caveat out there.
Any questions, observations, thoughts? Yeah. Yeah. Or maybe you should come up to the mic, actually. Yeah, it looks like we have a mic, so put you on the spot.
Thank you. Question regarding the actual revenue collection from the users of some of these enterprises, whether it be from users in the bottom of the pyramid and so forth. Are there actual revenue collection mechanisms or innovative finance mechanisms in terms of securing payment and securing repayment of financial instruments that you believe if that was made more efficient, then it would help make the capital markets more efficient, and more prone to believing that this is a sustainable, reliable asset class to invest in?
Does anyone want to take that?
Well, one quick one is that the for-profit world is much better at collaboration than the nonprofit world. So if you look at banks, they collaborate on back office services a great deal. But you don't see enough nonprofits collaborating on servicing deals, for example. And we're always trying to promote collaboration among nonprofit financial intermediaries to be able to reach scale. And I know Clara does collaboration all the time with her colleagues, for example. Their association is an example of that as well. And I think that the nonprofit world needs to learn how to collaborate more effectively and to work more efficiently in terms of partnerships that are business-oriented.
I took your question a little differently. I think there are things like, cell phone banking and stuff that are going on out there that are really exciting and interesting technological change. And I think that part of what we're dealing with here is the conundrum that for many social bankers, it's more expensive to put the money out than to keep it inside. And that solving for the things like transaction cost, monitoring, you have, Kiva, for example, fabulous organization, lots of money pouring in. It actually ends up being more expensive to get it out on the street and get it back, and to monitor those deals and make sure they work, just like for us, except even more so. And for all, Axion, everybody, the micro enterprise lenders face this too. So those kinds of innovations, I don't have any except cell phone banking, but I think there's real promise there.
Yeah, the same.
Okay. Yes, back there.
My name is Rob Lindvine. I'm a student nerd. My question is, you mentioned that there's a need, that you wish there was a better way to measure social impact. And my question is, what progress you think has been made on that front in the past few years, and what is the most innovative example you can think of that you've seen of measuring social change?
Who wants to take that?
I can take
Julie?
that. I know that Rockefeller, I'm going to put a word out here for my colleagues at Rockefeller, have done a great job in setting up this global GIN, they call it. I just think of drinks when I hear that, but I think it's the Global Impact Investing Network, and they've done a huge amount of work. I think it's an effort called IRIS in trying to come up with some social impact measures. I've had an ongoing dialogue with them, though, because the crux of it is not so much in the measurement. The crux of it is in the credibility in the market. So can we take that great work in terms of coming up with measures and convince investors to put serious amounts of capital behind it? And that's the thing that I'm I want to see real money flowing in behind those measures. And once that happens, then I think we're in a new paradigm. But that's the real critical issue. Is the market test. Will the market believe and reflect on these social impact targets and put capital behind them?
John?
Well, the Roberts Social Investment Fund in San Francisco, Jed Emerson has written a lot of great stuff on social return on investment, and that's a good one to take a look at. But from the capital markets point of view, I'm not sure that they're particularly concerned about social return. They're just interested in return. And if you look at in 2007, the approximately $800 billion foundation pool was getting about 7%. In 2008, it had a negative 28%. And if they can come in at 4 or 5%, they're not going to feel too bad about that, probably. Right, Clara? And so we can pony up deals don't quote me at exact numbers, but we should be able to pony up some deals to get some investments that will be acceptable, particularly if there's political pressure on a pension fund or an insurance company, or if there is a CRA credit pressure on a bank.
I'm sorry to break the moderator rules for a second, just weigh in on this one, because it's something I think a lot about, which is one of the issues that at least foundations have is they're split. There's the proverbial Chinese wall between the people who manage the money and the people who give out the money. And the people who manage the money generally want to maximize their returns, and the people who give out the money want to focus on what they do. It's hard for the people on the giving out the money side to influence the people on the managing the money side to say a 4 or 5% return is actually acceptable, given that the IRS tells you to pay out 5%. That's been an age-old debate for foundations, and we at the Gates Foundation tried to get around that a little bit by saying the investors, you maximize your returns. We'll try to borrow against a little bit of your endowment to do the kind of stuff Julie's talking about and cover our cost of capital. But it's a very important nuance.
Luther Reagan, who's another one of these with the Heron Foundation, and they've done a lot of great work on mission-related investing. They've got over 30% of their endowment in mission-related investment, and they're at the top 25% of return with that portfolio. They've really been leading the charge in that. So Luther says that there's a moat between the two, and there's alligators in there, and there are machine guns, et cetera. It's two different worlds, just like I was commenting earlier about the nonprofit kind of personality and the investment banker types. But I think we're seeing a bridging of that. But it's up to us in the nonprofit world to pony up deals at scale. That's the key, so that we can in fact get capital markets investment in our field.
Yeah, just quickly, I want to raise a flag of caution, because I think as we progress in the sector, more and more monitoring and more social evaluation tools are popping up. It seems like every day there's a new one. And so as we try to gain the credibility of the market, I think we as an industry must decide on those tools we're actually backing, and therefore be an acceptable evaluation tool for the commercial sector to actually utilize. So just highlighting the point that there is a tipping point here of fragmentation within all of those evaluation tools, and ultimately they do then begin to compete with one another as opposed to information sharing.
Yeah, I think there is an innovation that both the foundation world and government. I mean, I like to fantasize. This is what happens when you're in the business way too long. You start fantasizing about extremely nerdy things like, the accounting is destiny movement and stuff like that. So to that end, if government and foundations, instead of being focused on inputs, and in the way they kind of ask for financial information from nonprofits, it's very clearly all about what you spent the money on, and instead start asking for information in a relatively standard way about what happened. And I mean, we're starting to get the basics of comparables, where you've got financial outcomes being measured by all foundations, government alike. You start having capacity metrics like square footage and numbers of full-time equivalent personnel. And then on top of that, you have your programmatic metrics, which are going to vary greatly, and within a certain subsector might be very consistent and maybe a standard set that's about production and change and something else. But once you start looking at comparables about outcomes, whatever they're for, instead of becoming obsessed with how you spent the money, it will change the culture of the sector. So accounting is destiny.
We got a Nat, someone who's been in the business too long. What do you want to be?
Whatever you decide.
Yeah, we're here and there and then here. Yeah. And if you can direct your question to anyone in particular, that might speed it up. Okay. My authority shows you.
My question is to ask you guys to look forward into the future more, and say that these instruments are being generated, they're working, they're generating streams of income. What happens next? Is there a secondary market? Are we all of a sudden trading rainforest bonds? I like the interest rate on your bond. Let's do a swap. What are the consequences of these things? I mean, are you letting the fox into the hen house?
Great question.
You mean like unintended consequences or something like that? Okay. Who wants?
I've been trying to. Well, I'm a hen basically who's been trying to manage foxes. It's been it's really sort of strange. That's why I made the Mark Rutte analogy earlier. It's just completely strange to me that I'm actually doing this kind of work. Just to come back to, I don't know how much we have to rely on the capital markets to save us. I would come back to policy. And if you look at something like the low-income housing tax credit, it was a gigantic spur to the creation of affordable housing in this country. The Community Reinvestment Act started in the late 70s to stop redlining, which is discrimination against people of color, basically, in terms of their ability to borrow money. That has had a huge impact on the ability to find credit in low and moderate income communities. The new markets tax credit, we had a lot of hope for, and we still do. And these are examples of providing a credit or an incentive. There's also this whole problem of success that Clara mentioned. In the community development field, the term gentrification is considered a really, really bad thing because people are being displaced. Poor people are being displaced. But the place is doing better. And suddenly, the community development corporation that was there isn't needed anymore. And then they keep looking at what's the deficits in the community. Well, there are a lot of assets in the community too, and this asset-based analysis of a neighborhood is a big deal for all of us.
Thank you. Leah.
No, I think it's an excellent question, and just from a personal perspective, we need to keep this question in check at all times. I know in raising money for our collateral fund to back the guarantees, creatively the conversations can go in different ways, and one of which is even issuing debt to raise money for the collateral fund. So you find yourself all of a sudden thinking of these elaborate derivatives for a social purpose, and I think that ultimately everyone in this room really keeps a social mindset and keeps themselves in check to answer that very question on a regular basis.
Hi, Julie.
Yeah, I'm going to make it bring it back to what we're trying to achieve. I think that's Clara's point, which is, and I'm going to bring it back. I spent a couple years in Africa working with small businesses on the ground, and there were lots of NGOs doing a lot of good, but the stories that I found most inspiring, the people that I was most just amazed by, were the entrepreneurs who were selling better food, who were distributing bed nets, who were setting up pharmacies that people could go buy medicines from. So, I'm not sure whether I'm a hen or a fox, but I really do believe in the power of good businesses to deliver good social value. And I think the more that we can tap into the entrepreneurs that are working within the populations that we want to serve, we're going to do a lot better than if we're kind of operating at that sort of theoretical level of finance. Finance is a tool. Finance is a tool that should create incentives for entrepreneurs to do good work. And I think that whenever we set up one of those instruments, we need to ground ourselves in the reality of entrepreneurs serving poor populations, and how do we help them do that better.
Nice. But one more, I think we probably have time for one more question. I think, yeah. Go ahead. Yeah, or you can speak loudly. Okay.
My name is Anna Levy, and I'm at SEPA. And actually had two questions. One was, there's a tremendous volume of interest in this field, as everybody here knows, and there are a lot of organizations and individuals doing a lot of great things, but to what extent is the volume also crowding the positive effects and accruing negative effects? What big mistakes are some of those organizations making? And the second one is there, for those who are working in international scenes, where it's almost everybody is there an effort also being made to engage sort of more educated populations, where people who are graduating from universities in those countries in particular, and to create an epicenter on the ground there as well, and not sort of have the stream running from the United States?
You cheated. You asked two questions. There's only one more. All right. Who wants to tackle one or both, or anyone?
I can speak less from the payment guarantee, but more from Malaria No More in particular. I mean, part of our mandate is investment catalyst as well as awareness catalyst. So we do a really strong effort in trying to engage the local population and create these epicenters on a regional basis, whether it be Western or Eastern Africa, to focus specifically on issues of malaria and engage the culture there.
And I'll just say one thing, which is that, as Julie said, Rockefeller and others are trying to create kind of coordinating entities that bring together folks in foundations and for-profit companies and nonprofits. And there is seemingly a moment in time right now, which is kind of fascinating on a number of levels. The Economist wrote a piece about it a week ago about innovation, financial innovation, and kind of the social sector. I don't know if you all saw that, but the author, and they're always anonymous, so you never can get back at them, but they were talking about kind of what everyone was doing, and is this a tipping point, to use that Gladwell point, about the way private equity was 20 years ago, where it used to be private equity deals were all done in isolation, then the industry matured a bit and they started working together, and then markets developed, and then there were secondary markets and blah, blah, blah. It's a question. There may be an interesting moment in time right now.
There's even such a thing as spiritual capital. It's being talked about by some foundations and some individuals. So there's, the word capital.
What is spiritual?
Well, that's a good question. It basically has to do with sort of greater purpose or something like that. Could I just make a plug? I'm always looking for your brothers and your sisters, your aunts, your uncles who are retired 35-year-old investment bankers who want to volunteer to work with Wall Street Without Walls. We're looking for volunteers, and then what we do is we plug them into groups that are looking to do transactions. Clara's group or on the ground CDCs, CDFIs. So we're always looking for good projects. We're always looking for good volunteers, and we're always looking for MBAs who want to be project associates in these transactions to write them up and be part of the transaction. We like to link students and the nonprofits and the for-profit bankers all in one kind of interesting fabric.
It's like the Nat Reform Project or something. All right. Any final words? Yeah.
Or the hen houses, the fox reforms. I really think, and I was thinking about this for a while because I thought to myself, well, is it the social sector? We want folks who are ordinarily in the private sector to go to the social sector and fix things up, right? Well, there are a lot of doubts that spring into one's mind these days about whether that's a good or a bad idea. And I think we have to be very cautious about letting the for-profit sector off the hook for delivering social value. And the reason there's such a gigantic mess to clean up is because the for-profit economy has made some dreadful mistakes and has not been doing its job. And the not-for-profit or the auxiliary or the social sector, whatever you want to call it, has a much bigger job when the for-profit sector isn't actually performing very well. And this is one of those moments. So I think that it's a mistake to immediately assume you should run over to the social sector side of the boat. Because, in a way, the ambivalent piece of the business reality of our sector is that we want to try to get ourselves to go out of business. I mean, many of us. Some of us are institutions, but a lot of us are auxiliaries or intermittent or here to solve a problem that we hope will go away and there won't be any need for us. There's lots of case studies about that. So I think it's a big mistake to assume that the best thing to do is either to start a new organization that will help the social sector or get into the social sector and bring all of that business knowledge. I think it's, in a way, the moment to take the social knowledge and go to the for-profit sector.
Yeah.
So I would just
Hear, hear.
vote for that.
Any final word?
No, I would issue the same challenge.
Julie, anything? Well, maybe we can thank our panelists. You're very insightful.